The alarm clock didn't just ring. It screamed, piercing the silence of a one-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of old coffee and exhaustion. Lena Townsend stared at the ceiling, her body aching before her feet even touched the cold floor. 31 years old, 2 jobs, 1 daughter, and exactly $22 in her bank account. This was the reality of a single mother living on the edge of a cliff where one bad day could mean losing everything. But today wasn't just any day. Today, her mother alone in Charlotte was hurt. Today, a single decision would force Lena to choose between a flight she couldn't afford and the quiet agony of letting a stranger suffer. She didn't know then that the choice she made on a hard, unforgiving airport tile would tear her life apart, only to rebuild it into something she had only ever dreamed of. She didn't know that the woman shaking on the floor, surrounded by her own spilled life, was the very person who held the key to Lena's future. Most people walk past the pain of others because they are terrified of the inconvenience. Lena didn't have the luxury of fear. She only had the weight of her conscience. The terminal was a blur of fluorescent lights, rushed business travelers, and the deafening indifference of a crowd that looked everywhere except down at the person who needed them most. As Lena stood 15 feet away, her boarding pass clutched in her trembling fist, the final call for Flight 1124 crackled over the speakers. If she turned right, she would be with her mother. If she turned left, she would be on her knees, wasting the last of her savings on a woman she didn't know. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the gate, then back at the woman on the floor. In that heartbeat, Lena made the choice that would change history. She let go of the boarding pass, dropped her duffel bag, and fell to her knees, sacrificing her last dollar to save a stranger's life. The cold from the airport tile seeped through her jeans, but Lena barely felt it. Her focus was absolute. The woman, silver-haired, pale and trembling violently, was staring into the void, her breathing ragged. A small bottle of nitroglycerin lay just out of reach, its label catching the light like a beacon of hope in a dark room. Lena didn't think about her rent, her daughter, or the fact that she was now stranded in an airport with $0 to her name. She only thought about the residents she cared for in her nursing home, the people who had no one else, just like this woman. "Ma'am, can you hear me? I'm here. You're not alone." The woman's eyes fluttered, locking on to Lena's with a terrifying, glassy intensity. With the steady, practiced hands of a woman who had spent years handling life-and-death situations for minimum wage, Lena administered the medication. She dialed 911 with a calm, clinical voice that betrayed none of the internal panic she felt. Behind her, the gate door clicked shut. The sound was final. The flight she had sacrificed everything to board was gone. The money was gone. She was now a stranger in her own city, tethered to a dying woman in the middle of a bustling, indifferent terminal. As the minutes ticked by, the shaking began to subside. The color returned to the woman's face, not like a sunrise, but like a faint ember catching light. The woman reached out, gripping Lena's wrist with a desperate, crushing strength. It wasn't a thank you. It was a plea. "Please don't leave." And for the next 8 minutes, Lena did exactly what no traveler ever does. She stopped, she sat, and she stayed. She unwound her own scarf, draping it over the woman's shoulders as if to shield her from the cold, uncaring world surrounding them. She didn't know that she was currently sitting next to a legacy, nor did she know that she was being watched. From the gate podium, a quiet observer was noting every single move. The medical team arrived, their presence a blur of motion and efficiency. They lifted the woman, Eleanor, into a wheelchair, and Lena found herself following them. She didn't ask if she could come. She simply fell into step, an invisible shadow protecting a stranger. In the medical suite, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic mocking beep of a heart monitor. Eleanor, still clutching the cotton scarf Lena had given her, watched the younger woman with a gaze that felt like it was reading the very chapters of her life. Lena sat in a plastic chair, her phone face down on her knee, hiding the crushing reality that she had no way to get to her mother. When Eleanor reached into her handbag and offered $500, the temptation was physical. It was freedom. It was rent. It was relief. But Lena shook her head. "I didn't do it for that." She whispered the words honest and plain. Eleanor studied her not with pity, but with a profound, unsettling recognition. She handed Lena a card, heavy, cream-colored with engraved lettering, and said, "If you ever need anything, call this number." When Lena walked out of that airport and boarded a 12-hour Greyhound bus to Charlotte, she was exhausted, broke, and alone. She felt like she had failed. She didn't know that she had actually succeeded in the most impossible way. Days later, back in the grind of double shifts and shelf-stocking, the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar voice from Crestline Aviation Holdings. The name on the business card she had pocketed like a receipt, which she hadn't bothered to read properly, was the founder of the airline she had meant to fly. The old woman on the floor wasn't just a passenger, she was the architect of the entire company. Lena sat in the break room, the vending machine humming in the background, staring at the card that weighed nothing, but now shifted the gravity of her entire existence. The meeting at Crestline headquarters was not a business transaction. It was a reckoning. When Lena stepped into the conference room, she saw her own scarf folded neatly on the table, displayed with the reverence of a historical artifact. Eleanor Whitfield sat across from her, not as a chairwoman, but as a survivor who had been saved by the one person who cared enough to stop. Eleanor offered her everything: lifetime travel, a high-level position in a new wellness division, and a scholarship for single mothers. But when Lena heard the offer, she didn't jump. She felt the weight of every struggle she had ever endured, every time she had to say no to her daughter, every time she had sat in the dark, wondering if she was enough. She accepted not for the money, but for the chance to ensure that no one else would ever have to feel as invisible as she had. Within 6 months, the ripple effect was undeniable. Lena wasn't just a mother struggling to get by anymore. She was a leader training gate agents, teaching them to see the people behind the boarding passes. Her daughter, Zoe, was in better schools, and her mother was safe and cared for. The story, once hidden in a small corner of an airport, became a national symbol of character. But the most profound change wasn't the salary or the upgrades. It was the moment Lena returned to the same terminal 1 year later and saw a young woman crying by a charging station. Instead of walking by, Lena knelt down. She stopped, just as she had before. She didn't do it because it was strategic or because it would yield a reward. She did it because for the first time in her life, she had the power to make sure that kindness wasn't just a random act, but a standard. The story of Lena Townsend is the story of what happens when you stop for someone, even when it costs you everything. It is a reminder that we are all walking through airports, both literal and metaphorical, every day, choosing whether to look up or to look away. Kindness is never wasted. It is an investment in a future you cannot yet see. The silence of the break room was broken only by the rhythmic hum of the ancient refrigerator. Lena stared at the business card. It felt heavy in her hand like lead, yet it was just a small piece of cardstock. She thought back to the nights she spent sitting at her kitchen table tracing the wood grain, wondering how she would pay for electricity. She remembered the look on her daughter Zoe's face, the forced maturity of a 5-year-old who knew that being tired was her mother's default setting. Every time Lena had to say no to a toy, a book, or a school trip, it felt like a small failure of her own character. Now, looking at the name Eleanor Whitfield, embossed in gold, she realized that those moments of hardship hadn't broken her. They had forged her. She recalled the specific scent of the airport terminal, that night the sterile mix of floor cleaner and stale coffee. She remembered the way the businessman had stepped over Eleanor's handbag without even a downward glance. Why did he do that? Because it was easier. Because his mind was on his next meeting, his next flight, his next success. But Lena had been forced by her own life of struggle to look down. When you have spent years cleaning floors and caring for those who can no longer care for themselves, you see things that others miss. You see the subtle tremor of a hand, the way a person's breath hitches when they are truly scared. She realized then that her misfortune, the broken car, the lack of money, had actually been her greatest preparation. If she had been a wealthy traveler, would she have knelt? If she had been running to a first-class lounge, would she have noticed the amber pill bottle? The universe has a strange way of placing the right people in the right places at the most critical moments, but it requires the person to actually be present. Lena had been present. She had been fully, agonizingly present. And now she was standing at the threshold of a completely different existence. She didn't call Terrence Adams immediately. She sat there for 10 minutes just breathing, letting the reality wash over her. She thought of her mother in Charlotte waiting for a recovery that was stalled by financial stress. She thought of Zoe, who would no longer have to color alone in a dark corner of an after-school program. The transformation wasn't just about money. It was about the restoration of her dignity. She had traded her last flight for a human life, and in return, the universe was handing her a future where she could finally breathe. The new training program at Crestline Aviation was not what anyone expected. When Lena walked into the training room for the first time, she wasn't wearing a suit or a uniform. She was wearing her heart on her sleeve. She didn't talk about corporate policy. She didn't show boring PowerPoint slides about liability. She stood in front of 12 gate agents, all of whom had seen thousands of passengers walk by in a blur of anonymity. She told them the story. She described the way the airport lights looked when you were on your knees. She described the specific hollow sound of a pill bottle hitting the tile. She told them about the woman who was a titan of industry, reduced to a trembling, vulnerable human being by a cardiac event. You think you're just scanning tickets, Lena said, her voice steady and echoing off the walls. But every single person you see is carrying a story, a burden, or a secret struggle. You are the last line of defense between someone's worst day and a tragedy. The agents, usually jaded by the endless cycle of flight delays and angry travelers, went silent. Some were looking down at their own hands. Some were thinking about their own mothers. Lena's influence wasn't just policy. It was a culture shift. She created the Wellness Initiative, a protocol that taught staff to recognize the physical signs of distress that were usually ignored in the rush of travel. She implemented a human-first approach, where gate agents were given the autonomy to pause, assist, and prioritize human life over strict boarding schedules. And it worked. Within months, incident reports of missed medical emergencies dropped significantly. The ripple effect of her one decision was touching thousands of lives she would never even meet. She was no longer just a former CNA from a low-income apartment. She was the architect of empathy for one of the largest airlines in the world. And yet every evening she returned to her new home, tucked her daughter into a bed with soft, expensive sheets, and read her a story. She remained the same woman who had knelt on that cold floor, grounded by the memory of how close she had come to losing everything. She knew that the power she held now was not a prize to be enjoyed, but a responsibility to be stewarded. She continued to visit her mother in Charlotte every weekend, not on a Greyhound bus, but in the quiet, comfortable seat of a plane she had once dreamed of flying on. The cycle of poverty that had defined her 30s was broken not by winning the lottery, but by a single act of radical, inconvenient kindness. Years later, as Lena sat at her desk in the regional headquarters, she found herself looking out at the tarmac again. She saw the planes taking off silver flashes against the blue Atlanta sky. Each one represented hundreds of stories, families reuniting, business deals being made, people moving toward their futures. And in every one of those planes, she knew there was a human being who, just like her, was carrying a hidden weight. She looked down at her own hands, still the same hands that had held Eleanor's wrist on the terminal floor. She had learned that character is not something you display when everything is going well. It is something you reveal when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. People often ask her if she regrets missing that flight. They ask if she ever wonders what would have happened if she had just kept walking toward her gate. Lena always smiles when they ask. She knows that if she had kept walking, she would have arrived at her mother's house a few hours earlier, yes, but she would have arrived as the same woman, frightened, exhausted, and barely holding on. By missing that flight, she didn't just help a stranger. She saved herself from a life of shrinking. She had forced the universe to notice her not through ambition, but through service. The scholarship fund was thriving. Every year she met the new recipients, women just like her single mothers, who were working double shifts, sacrificing their sleep to build a future for their children. She read their letters, heard their stories, and recognized the same fire she had once felt. She was no longer alone in her struggle. She had created a community of people who believed that kindness was a tangible, powerful force. Eleanor, who had since retired fully, still called her once a month. They didn't talk about airline operations or corporate strategy. They talked about Zoe, about life, about the quiet joy of being seen. The scarf, that thin cotton blue scarf, was still in Lena's possession. It was a physical reminder of the night that divided her life into before and after. It was a testament to the fact that when you choose to care, you change the trajectory of everything around you. As she stood up from her desk to go pick up Zoe from school, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had learned the greatest lesson of all, that the most important journey you will ever take isn't to a destination, but to the person beside you. And that, in the end, is the only thing that truly lasts. The story of Lena Townsend was never really about the airline or the wealth or the recognition. It was about the simple, quiet, and beautiful truth that when you stop for someone else, you finally arrive at your own destiny. The office of the Passenger Wellness Division was filled with soft, warm light, a stark contrast to the harsh, unforgiving glare of the airport terminal from a year prior. Lena sat at her desk reviewing the latest batch of applications for the Townsend Whitfield Scholarship. Each essay was a window into a life of struggle, a mother working night shifts in a hospital, another juggling 3 part-time jobs while finishing a nursing degree, a third trying to keep her family together after an eviction. As she read, Lena felt a visceral connection to every word. She didn't just see applicants. She saw the versions of herself that had existed before the world finally took notice. She remembered the specific sting of pride she used to feel when she managed to save $5 from the grocery budget. She remembered the way she would lie to Zoe, telling her that the macaroni and cheese dinner was a special treat just to hide the fact that there was nothing else in the cupboard. These women were the unsung heroes of the world, carrying families on their backs with silent, aching strength. She picked up her pen, not just to approve funding, but to write personalized notes of encouragement to each one. She knew that sometimes the most important thing a person can receive isn't just money. It's the validation that their struggle is seen and that their kindness matters. The ripple effect was growing. In the training rooms, she saw young gate agents, people who had previously been hardened by the relentless pace of their jobs, now stopping to ask elderly passengers if they needed assistance, not because it was in the manual, but because they had heard the story of the blue scarf. One agent, a man named Marcus, who had been at the company for 10 years, confessed to Lena after a seminar, "I used to think that efficiency was the only thing that mattered. I thought that if I kept the line moving, I was doing my job. But hearing how you saw the person behind the symptoms changed everything. Now I see faces, not just tickets." That moment proved to Lena that her mission was working. The goal wasn't to change the entire industry overnight, but to change the people who ran it one heartbeat at a time. She was planting seeds of empathy in a landscape of indifference. She knew that every time an agent paused to help someone, the world became a slightly less lonely place. And in those moments, Lena felt the true weight of her decision. The sacrifice of that single last-minute flight had blossomed into an infrastructure of care that was touching thousands. Once a month, Lena would visit Eleanor Whitfield at her estate. These visits were far removed from the sterile, high-pressure environments they both used to inhabit. They would sit on a terrace overlooking a sprawling garden, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the quiet hum of nature. Eleanor was a different woman now, or perhaps she was just finally being herself. She often spoke of her late husband Gerald and the early lean days of building Crestline. "We had nothing, Lena," she would say, her eyes reflecting the sunlight. "We had 2 propeller planes and a dream that everyone told us was foolish. But we succeeded because we cared about the people we carried. Somewhere along the way I forgot that. I let the suits, the numbers, and the bottom lines obscure the simple truth that we are in the business of human connection." Lena would listen, sipping tea, grateful for the perspective. It was easy to get lost in the corporate success of her current life, but these afternoons kept her rooted. She shared stories of Zoe's progress in school, the way she was becoming more confident, and how she no longer flinched when the doorbell rang, fearing a landlord or a bill collector. Eleanor listened with genuine delight, treating Zoe's small victories as if they were major corporate milestones. They talked about the nature of character, about how easy it is to be kind when the world is looking, and how difficult it is to be kind when you are exhausted, alone, and invisible. Eleanor confessed that she had spent years feeling like a spectator in her own company, trapped by the expectations of her position. "You gave me back my agency, Lena," Eleanor told her one afternoon. "You showed me that even at 71, and even from the floor of a terminal, I still had a purpose. You didn't just save my life. You helped me reclaim it." Lena realized then that the bond they shared wasn't transactional. It was a partnership of spirits who had both known the hollow ache of being overlooked. They were no longer the founder and the employee. They were 2 women who had looked into the abyss of a cold, indifferent world and had chosen to reach out a hand. This friendship became the foundation of Lena's strength, a sanctuary where she could be raw and honest about the challenges of her new life. She found that the more she shared, the lighter she felt, and the more she was able to give back to the world. The most profound shift, however, was happening in Zoe. She had spent the first 5 years of her life in the shadows of her mother's exhaustion, learning to be quiet so as not to add to the burden. Now, She was blooming. She was in a school where she was encouraged to speak, to draw, to be loud, and to be curious. One evening, as they were sitting at the dinner table, Zoe looked up from her book and said, "Mama, do you remember the rainbow drawing I gave you before you went to the airport?" Lena smiled, her heart swelling. "I still have it, baby. It's in the side pocket of my duffel, right where it's always been." Zoe nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I think that drawing was magic. It helped you come back to me." Lena didn't have the heart to tell her that the magic wasn't in the paper or the crayons. It was in the spirit Zoe herself had cultivated. It was in the way she had sat quietly in the dark, watching her mother, waiting for the moments when she could be a comfort. Lena realized that Zoe had been the strongest person in their lives all along. She had absorbed the hardship without losing her capacity for wonder. Now, witnessing her daughter's growth, Lena felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She wasn't just working for a paycheck anymore. She was working to build a world that would be worthy of Zoe's light. She began to involve Zoe in the scholarship programs, taking her to meetings or letting her help pack the welcome kits for the recipients. Zoe learned that kindness was an active, deliberate practice. She saw how her mother worked, how she treated people, and how she held herself with a quiet, grounded confidence. The cycle of fear that had dominated their lives was replaced by a sense of security and purpose. Lena knew that she could never fully protect Zoe from the difficulties of life, but she could teach her how to navigate them with character. She could show her that even in the face of impossible odds, you can choose to be the person who stops. And that lesson was the most valuable inheritance she could ever give her daughter. The apartment was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a home filled with laughter, shared meals, and the warm golden glow of a future that was finally within their grasp. Donna Pratt. The gate agent at B-26 had spent 20 years in the airport industry. She had seen it all, the frantic businessmen, the crying children, the lost souls, and the angry commuters. Her life was measured in boarding times, seat assignments, and the occasional inevitable delay. But the night Lena Townsend knelt on that cold floor, something inside Donna shifted. It wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a profound rupture in the ordinary fabric of the terminal. Donna had watched from behind her podium, her hand hovering over the microphone. She could have called for security to clear the area to keep the flow of passengers moving, to avoid the clutter of a human moment in a space designed for transit. Instead, she did the unthinkable. She paused. She watched the way Lena moved, not with hesitation, but with an instinctual, raw compassion. That night, when Donna went home, she didn't sleep. She sat in her living room, the house silent around her, and replayed the scene in her mind. Why did that woman matter? Why did that stranger on the floor, who she later discovered was Eleanor Whitfield, deserve more care than the thousands of other passengers who had walked by? Donna realized that the airport was a metaphor for life. We are all in transit, all rushing toward our own destinations, all convinced that our schedules are the most important things in the universe. She began to see her own career through a new lens. She stopped being just an agent of the airline and started being an agent of human connection. She began to take extra time with the elderly passengers, the lost and the confused. She started looking into people's eyes when she scanned their boarding passes. It was a small, almost imperceptible change, but it rippled through the entire B concourse. When she was later promoted to supervisor, she didn't change her style. She amplified it. She encouraged her team to see the humanity in the rush. She became the gatekeeper of empathy. Her story, which eventually surfaced in a local news feature, highlighted a truth often forgotten in a fast-paced world, that you don't need to be the hero of the main narrative to change the outcome. Sometimes being the one who observes, respects, and supports the act of kindness is just as revolutionary as the act itself. Donna's journey was the silent echo of Lena's courage, proving that goodness is contagious even in the most sterile environments. The concept of the last flight became a recurring theme in the training modules Lena developed for Crestline. She didn't call it customer service training, she called it the last flight perspective. She taught her teams that every interaction could be someone's last interaction of the day, of the week, or perhaps their last moment of connection before a crisis. She challenged them to ask themselves, if this were the last time I could show someone I care, would I be moving this fast? It was a radical question in an industry defined by velocity. It pushed the employees to reconsider the value of their own presence. Some resisted, of course. They argued that there was no time, that the schedules were too tight, that they were underpaid and overworked. Lena didn't argue with them. She simply shared her story, the $22 in her bank account, the exhaustion that felt like a physical weight, the feeling of being invisible to the world. She showed them that even when you have nothing, you have the power to stop. She taught them that kindness is not a luxury for the wealthy. It is a discipline for the human. The impact of this philosophy was profound. It didn't just improve passenger satisfaction scores, it improved the morale of the employees. They began to feel that their work had meaning beyond the logistics of transport. They weren't just moving bodies from one city to another, they were facilitating the most important moments of people's lives. Lena's influence reached into the boardrooms and the baggage handling areas alike. She bridged the gap between the corporate elite and the operational workers, creating a culture where a janitor's observation was as valuable as a vice president's report. She had taken the lowest point of her life, a moment of profound failure, and turned it into a blueprint for a better way of living. It was a testament to the idea that our worst moments are not the end of our stories. They are the raw materials for the people we are meant to become. The last flight wasn't about missing a plane. It was about stopping long enough to find your purpose. And for those who worked at Crestline, it became a daily reminder that the world is only as good as the care we are willing to show the person standing right in front of us. The scholarship program, the Townsend Whitfield Initiative, became more than just a financial aid system. It became a sanctuary. The monthly meetings held in Atlanta were filled with the stories of single mothers who were fighting against the crushing weight of reality. They were nurses working during the pandemic, students raising children while studying, and caregivers struggling with the dual burden of work and family. Lena made it a point to be present at every meeting. She didn't sit at the head of the table. She sat in the middle among them as an equal. She listened to their fears, their failures, and their quiet, whispered dreams. She found that the greatest gift she could give them wasn't just the tuition coverage. It was the space to be human. They shared the same experiences, the guilt of being tired, the fear of not being enough, the challenge of explaining the world to children who were growing up too fast. In those rooms, they found a collective strength that none of them could have summoned alone. Lena became a mentor, a sister, and a mirror. She saw her own past in each of them, and she saw their future in the success of the graduates. One woman, a mother of 3 who had just completed her phlebotomy certification, wrote to Lena, "You didn't just give me the money to pay for school. You gave me the permission to believe that I was worth the investment." That note, which Lena kept on her desk, summarized the entire mission of her work. She wasn't just training healthcare workers. She was empowering a generation of mothers to see their own value. The bond they formed was deeper than any professional network. It was an unspoken covenant of mutual support. They knew that when one of them succeeded, it was a victory for all. They celebrated each other's milestones, the first job, the first promotion, the first thank you from a patient. They created a culture of success built on the foundation of shared struggle. Lena's journey had come full circle. From the woman who couldn't afford a flight to the woman who was helping others navigate the currents of life, she had discovered that true power is found in the ability to lift others up. The initiative was a living, breathing testament to the fact that when a single mother is given a chance, she doesn't just improve her own life, she changes the world around her. And Lena was the living, breathing evidence of that truth.